There's a very useful analogy between U.S. electoral politics and professional wrestling that has been in the ether for a number of years. Over the last roughly decade or so, this analogy has gained more and more traction. I suppose we could delineate the timeline as roughly the Trump era, but I think the comparison is inevitable because Trump has appeared as a character in storylines in the WWE, which is the biggest professional wrestling promotion in the world, after all. I have a story to tell about the evolution of the analogy between politics and professional wrestling, and I've had it on a list of things I'd like to write about or make a video about for years. One of the main reasons, though, that I have avoided it is that I really don't like discussing politics. If I attempt to do so, I end up feeling the constant need to self-censor, and even if I do self-censor, I feel like I need to walk on eggshells because the programming people receive on a population level from the media feels like an impossible barrier to entry. And I'm not excerpting myself from this and saying that I am some sort of uniquely enlightened person on these topics. I just haven't paid much attention to politics in many years because long ago I learned that it was no different than needing to stay up to date on the storylines of professional wrestling. In this video, I will attempt to explain why I came to this conclusion and where I first encountered the analogy between politics and pro wrestling. And I will also try to explain the true genius and beauty in the analogy because it goes a lot deeper than a simple comparison, and it fleshes out the many moving parts in maintaining a universe where fiction and reality are garbled together like a slushie in a blender. Or, borrowing a more elegant turn of phrase from pro wrestling, it explains what happens when you work yourself into a shoot, brother. Section 1. The immense usefulness of the terminology of pro wrestling. In wrestling, there are terms for real and fake. A work is the term for a staged event. Wrestlers work a match, or work the fans, or marks, as they are referred to in the Carney-inspired lexicon of pro wrestling.
And that jabroni Brian Blair.
A shoot is when something is for real. Wrestlers give shoot interviews where they supposedly dish the real dirt, but wrestlers are also carnies at heart, so they are always working the audience. Where things get really interesting is when, as the great Hulk Hogan once said, you work yourself into a shoot. Sometimes the lines are blurred, and what started as a work becomes a shoot, or vice versa. There's also an old wrestling term called Kayfabe, which is the act of presenting something that is staged as a genuine competition.
Did anyone tell you about protecting the business?
Oh, yeah. We call it kayfabe. Protecting our business, that's what made our money.
Kayfabe also has a meaning something like omerta in the mafia, a code of silence, where there is an implicit agreement between everyone in the business to not reveal the secrets of the business. The general formula for staging conflict in wrestling is that you have a good guy and a bad guy competing in a match over some sort of personal issue. In wrestling speak, the good guy is the babyface and the bad guy is the heel. The issue is usually something involving someone stealing somebody else's girlfriend or disrespecting someone, or any number of similar formulations.
You see two guys on the side of the road in a heck of a fight. You want to pull over and see what's going to happen, right? And there's a big guy and a little guy. And that big guy is wailing on that little guy. But then, because you're a human, and it's human nature, the little guy comes up off the shoulder of the road and starts firing back. You don't know who these people are, but you see it, you get with it. Now imagine if you know that little guy, who he is, and that you like him, and that he's your hero, and that big guy, what a prick he is. Now instead of just driving down the road and stopping, you might want to pay $5 or $10 or whatever it is to see that fight, to see whether the little guy can kick the shit out of the big guy and get even for you. That's wrestling.
In reality, all of this is a staged conflict put on for show. Behind the curtain and outside of the ring, known as the squared circle in wrestling, the wrestlers may actually be friends. Their real-life relationship bears little or no relation to what happens during the matches. A similar set of staging artifice happens in politics at the highest levels. The institutional power creates an illusion of adversarial conflict. The media creates or responds to personal issues to debate over. In the media and on the floor of Congress or other political bodies, politicians from the two parties, babyfaces and heels, however you define them, give speeches and outline their positions. In wrestling parlance, this is called cutting a promo. This is how you sell the marks and get them to engage.
How do you feel about Brian Blair today?
Well, he deserved it because that jabroni, he used to brag about himself. So I want to know how many times that jabroni, Brian, what was his name?
Blair.
Yeah, Brian Blair. He's so jabroni, I didn't even forgot about his name.
Where it gets interesting is that there are levels to the system. There are people who have been totally captured by the power centers of politics who are cynical actors. They know everything they are doing is for show, and behind the scenes they are buddies with their perceived enemies. And then you have the true believers. I think of these people as the "it's still real to me, damn it" guys. Section 2, "it's still real to me, damn it," or the tension between real and fake. There's an infamous clip of a wrestling fan at a question and answer session where the fan becomes emotional when he has an opportunity to ask a question. This Q&A panel happened in 2005, shortly after the untimely death of popular wrestler Eddie Guerrero, also known as Latino Heat. Guerrero was from a large and famous wrestling family in Mexico and is considered to be an influential figure in modern professional wrestling. He died at age 38 from heart failure, which was likely caused by the abuse of his body from the insane schedule of wrestling and the cocktail of chemicals he was on to withstand the punishing workload. The emotional fan's name is Dave Wills, and he wanted to acknowledge the very real sacrifices that men like Guerrero had made in service of their craft, which has become derided in the modern era for being fake. This might be the purest expression of the schizoid nature of professional wrestling. Right after expressing his genuine appreciation for the toll these men had taken for their art, Dave becomes verklempt and his voice begins to quiver as he says the line, which became a meme and has taken on a life of its own.
Next question, Jeff, where are you? Right there.
Yeah. I just want to thank each and every one of y'all for all you've done to your bodies. It's still real to me, damn it. I mean, thank you.
Easy, man.
Thank y'all guys. Y'all are awesome. Thank you so much, Mr. Funk, for saying what needed to be said. I don't want to see it. Another one of these.
Well,
Dave was referring to the metaphysical nature of wrestling and his suspension of disbelief. He was talking about how much these modern gladiators went through and how they were often disrespected by polite society and the highbrow types who see professional wrestling as less than and as a fake enterprise that can only be enjoyed by dumb yokels. I think it's especially important that I added the context of the death of Guerrero and that we focus on the last part of what Wills said. I don't want to see another one of these.
I don't want to see another one of these.
Well,
This was incredibly prescient as about 2 years later, Guerrero's very good friend Chris Benoit would take his own life and that of his wife and son in one of the most gruesome incidents in the already sordid history of professional wrestling. The death of Benoit and his family were likely caused by a similar constellation of issues as Guerrero's, given that both were taking steroids to deal with the impossibly demanding schedules, and both men also likely had significant CTE from repeated head trauma. In this light, Dave Wills isn't a good target for derision. The world should have listened to this man, as he had important insight, unlike basically every political pundit taking up airtime on major television networks. What makes the professional wrestling and politics metaphor so interesting is that the interaction between real and fake creates emergent properties. In other words, it creates a complex system with a life of its own. Things happen in the gray space between the real and the constructed that we could not predict. Behind the scenes of both wrestling and politics, there is a collaborative relationship, but these relationships are subject to the same vagaries as all relationships. There are always competing factions, young upstarts and veteran coalitions. Human beings have evolved to work together in clans with in-groups and out-groups. Section 3, Outlaw Mud Shows. The great conspiracy researcher John Judge talked about how most people think that the politicians in Washington, D.C. sometimes need to hire some bad guys from the shadowy world of intelligence to help them out with particularly sensitive projects. In reality, Judge said, it was the other way around. The secret government, the deep state, a term that has been co-opted, sadly, were the ones who hire the politicians to sell the people on their agenda.
This is my beef with Bill Moyer's secret government tape, if any of you have seen that. He says that we have this legitimate government in the White House, but in order to get some dirty jobs done once in a while, they go out and they hire these bad elements which they really shouldn't do, and these bad elements get them into trouble and into scandals, and they really just ought to stop doing that. I say those bad elements, the killers and the gun runners, the drug runners, are the government. And they in turn go out and hire the PR boys and the three-suit boys and the dummies who'll wave their hat in front of you and make you think you've got a government.
One of the emergent properties of the current construct in Washington is that we get a new crop of politicians every couple of years, and many of these people are, in fact, marks. When I see somebody like George Santos, the congressman who was convicted of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, I see a perfect example of someone who thought the construct of politics was real. If anyone is really the "it's still real to me, damn it" guy, it's George Santos. In pro wrestling terms, Santos would be known as an Outlaw Mud Show guy. An Outlaw Mud Show is a term from the territory days in the 1980s and before, when the WWE hadn't yet created a monopoly. Outlaw shows were shows that were booked on the fringes of established wrestling territories without the proper oversight by athletic commissions, which were in charge of professional wrestling before the modern era of sports entertainment, where Vince McMahon and the WWE admitted wrestling was staged so as to avoid the regulation of the types of commissions that regulate genuine athletic competitions like boxing. The big wrestling companies that each ruled a territory, like a cartel, hated Outlaw Mud Shows because they cheapened the image of wrestling and gave away some of the secrets. Outlaw shows would feature less skilled wrestlers, and so the suspension of disbelief became more difficult for the audience. The larger federations would go to great lengths to chase off these Outlaw Mud Show events, just as the large federations of the Democrats and Republicans went to great lengths to flush George Santos out of the system. He makes them all look bad and reveals how broken the system is. Section 4. The media as the referee to sell the legitimacy of the contest. The layer where the metaphor between pro wrestling and politics gets really interesting is when you expand the view outwards to include the media. The media is like the referee in pro wrestling. The media is there to make the entire competition appear legitimate and like there is a watchdog and an impartial arbiter. From here, you can really run with the metaphor because the media in the United States especially performs like a pro wrestling referee. There's a spot or trope in professional wrestling known as the referee distraction spot, where a referee becomes distracted by something, like somebody from outside the match interfering or some other disturbance, and while the ref's back is turned and they are dealing with a distraction, a competitor in the match, usually the heel or the bad guy, will use an illegal move or bring an illegal weapon into the match to create an unfair advantage. There are a million versions of this trope, just like there are a million ways that the media can coordinate in the pro wrestling federation known as U.S. party politics. There's a facade of objectivity on the part of the media, a posture that they're the objective referee calling it straight down the middle. This facade has worn thin over the last many years as the media has taken to reporting on politics in an attempt to influence politics rather than using their reporting to inform their audience. Pro wrestling emerged from the Greco-Roman style of wrestling, and the economic incentives or the need for control on the behalf of promoters perhaps made it inevitable that the referee would be co-opted. Kayfabe can be accomplished with just the two opposing sides, the heel and the babyface, but it becomes much more convincing and durable if the outside arbiter can be brought into the conspiracy. This happens in all sorts of areas of life, like in regulatory capture, where big business co-ops regulatory agencies. Section 5. Hugh Turley and the magical origins of the analogy. The first time I ever heard this analogy was about 10 years ago. I was becoming more and more interested with learning about the Clinton years in the 90s, and I had taken to reading accounts of that time period that went beyond the surface level of interpretation. This was inspired because I had worked on a murder case from the 1980s where I had discovered that the FBI labs had been discredited in a number of the forensic sciences they supposedly had expertise in during that same period, the 1990s, including hair and fiber comparison. Through my reading, I discovered a guy named Hugh Turley. Turley is a fascinating guy who's had a wealth of life experiences, including being a stage magician and making training films for the FBI and being a wrestling ring announcer. A theory like the one that analogizes professional wrestling and politics could only have sprung from the mind of somebody like Turley, who had a broad base of life experiences to draw on. Here's a clip of Turley from a documentary from about 20 years ago giving a brief summary of the analogy.
They'll focus all the attention on Monica Lewinsky or some other issue, O.J. Simpson. The public is all looking at all the noise and all the action, or they talk about how the Democrats, Republicans are really going at it, and you got James Carville battling with Ken Starr. And it appears that this is where the real action is, but it's not. It's the big noise and motion covering up the little motion. And when people are looking up here at this hand that's moving, they don't see what my other hand is doing. And that's what the press does. And they do it very well. It's a lot like a wrestling match too, because it looks like they're fighting. There's a lot of adversarial thing. It looks like there's a liberal media and a conservative media, and you got Limbaugh on one side.
I should also mention that Hugh Turley has recently co-written a couple of really interesting books about the monk Thomas Merton, who's an anti-war or religious leader in the 1960s, who Turley and another writer I really enjoy, DC Dave Martin, wrote a couple of books going into their hypothesis that Merton was actually killed in response to his opposition to the Vietnam War in 1968. Definitely worth checking out if that's something that sounds like it would interest you. And I think that there are just a lot more layers to peel back in examining the parallels between pro wrestling and politics. I think of it sort of as like a template or a heuristic for thinking about how humans organize themselves. So it does seem like there's something peculiar to the institutions of professional wrestling and politics that allowed them to evolve down a similar path. Maybe it's that they're so untethered to reality that there's no hard science to ground these arts. I don't know. But anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this strange parallel and what further layers you might see in The Onion. Thanks for watching.